I was standing in that damn lab on January 15th, 2025, when everything changed forever. Layla and I were working the night shift at CERN in the new complex that had been built over 2 years. Imagine a collider the size of half of Switzerland underground, with cooling systems that consumed as much energy as a small country. I was a technician, responsible for monitoring energy spikes. It was a standard routine, thousands of launches before this had gone off without a hitch. Layla entered the final command into Prometheus, our 7th-generation quantum AI. And I heard this sound, not exactly a sound, more like a vibration that went through my bones, through the air itself. Particles accelerated to a speed we previously thought was theoretically impossible, and at the moment of collision, the screens exploded with warnings. At first, I thought it was an accident, that a wave of radiation was about to hit us all and turn us into glowing corpses for safety textbooks. But the sensors were showing something completely insane. Matter had materialized in the synthesis chamber that shouldn't have been there. 0.003 of a gram of something that wasn't on any periodic table. The energy readings were so off the charts that the computers started rebooting, unable to process the numbers. Layla turned pale as a sheet, staring at the data hologram, and whispered that this tiny speck was emitting energy equivalent to the explosion of 1,000 suns, but steadily, without decay, without loss. I looked through the chamber's observation window and saw this glow, not bright, not blinding, but deep, as if an entire universe was burning inside that speck of dust. The next 3 hours were total chaos. All the scientific luminaries of Europe rushed in, along with the military, UN representatives, and even some guys in black suits with no insignia. They cordoned off the lab like we'd found a portal to hell rather than just a new material. Layla tried to explain what happened, but she didn't fully understand it herself. Prometheus had created conditions that existed only in the first microseconds after the Big Bang, and at that point, space-time seemed to turn inside out, birthing something fundamentally new. We called it the source because it didn't just contain energy, it generated it from nothing, from the very fabric of reality. The first test was conducted a week later. They connected a grain of the source to the Geneva city grid, and the entire city ran for 3 months on energy the size of a grain of sand. Even the meters didn't know how to track it. The world stood still in anticipation, realizing that something fundamental had occurred. I remember sitting in my apartment a month after the discovery, watching the news where scientists and politicians argued about what to do with this find, and I realized a simple thing. We had just skipped over every possible stage of civilizational development. Oil, gas, nuclear plants, solar panels, none of it was needed anymore. Overnight, it all turned into steam engines compared to a fusion reactor. Layla told me then that she felt like Oppenheimer. But in reverse, we hadn't created a bomb to destroy worlds, but a key to all the doors of the universe. But in her eyes, I saw fear, the same fear I felt myself, because humanity had been given the power of gods without having the wisdom to manage even its own planet, and no one knew what would happen next. 47 days later, I watched as the lights of nuclear power plants went out across the world simultaneously, not because of a catastrophe, but because they were no longer needed. I was on a business trip in Japan, helping integrate the source into Tokyo's power grid, and I saw engineers with tears in their eyes shutting down the Fukushima reactors, the very ones that once nearly destroyed half the country. An old Japanese man who had worked there for 30 years came up to me and said he had spent his whole life fearing a repeat of the disaster, and now that fear had simply vanished, as if someone had erased it from reality. The same thing was happening all over the planet. Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. All these places were turning into museums of a bygone era, a time when humanity played with dangerous fire because they didn't know any better. 68 days after the discovery, I was at home watching news about the Taiwan crisis, which was on the verge of escalating into World War III. Chinese ships had surrounded the island, American aircraft carriers were moving to intercept, and everyone was talking about nuclear war and the end of the world. And then, they just turned around and left. The conflict didn't end because of diplomacy or threats, but because it had lost its meaning. Why fight for territory, resources, or energy control when energy had become infinite and accessible to everyone? I remember a comment from an American general who said that for the first time in human history, war had become fundamentally economically unviable because there was nothing you could seize that you didn't already have. Borders began to dissolve on their own, not through revolutions or treaties, but simply because guarding them had become pointless. By the 100th day, the world had transformed beyond recognition, and I found myself at the center of this madness. I was transferred to Project New Dubai, where Arab sheiks decided to build the city of the future, a tower 15 kilometers high that was literally growing before our eyes, floor by floor, as source-powered construction drones worked 24 hours a day without a break. I stood at the bottom looking up, and the spire was lost in the clouds, even though we had only started 3 weeks ago. Entire cities floated across the oceans, artificial islands the size of Manhattan, where people lived in houses made of living material that grew and adapted to their needs. Medicine had leapt centuries forward. I saw my mother, who had stage 4 cancer, placed into a source-powered nano capsule, and 6 hours later, she walked out healthy, as if the disease had never existed. Even the scars from her old surgeries were gone. The year 2026 began with news that shocked everyone. The last person had died of natural causes, some old man in Norway who was 107 and had refused treatment, saying he had lived long enough. After him, death from disease, old age, or accidents became technically impossible. Source-powered nanotechnology repaired any damage, stopped aging at the cellular level, and even restored youth to those who had already grown old. By mid-year, borders had finally vanished. All nations merged into the planetary consortium, a single Earth government, because the old system of nations and armies simply stopped working in a world of abundance. I remember the day the final treaty was signed. People were crying in the streets, not out of grief, but from the realization that for the first time in history, we had truly become a unified humanity, without wars, without hunger, and without fear of tomorrow. The year 2028 found me in Mars orbit as the fleet's chief engineer aboard the Odyssey, humanity's first faster-than-light cruiser, a massive 8-kilometer beast that looked more like a flying city than a ship. I stood on the bridge next to Admiral Javier Cortez, a Spaniard with nerves of steel and the gaze of a man who had seen too much, looking out the viewports at a fleet of 50 ships lined up in battle formation around us. The Source allowed us to do the impossible, literally tearing space like a sheet of paper, creating tunnels through the very fabric of reality. And now we were preparing for the first interstellar jump to Proxima Centauri, the nearest star outside the solar system. All systems were green. The crew of 2,000 stood frozen in anticipation, and Cortez gave the order to begin the countdown. The jump started exactly by the book. The sources on all ships synchronized, space around the fleet began to warp, stars smeared into streaks of light, and I felt that strange sensation of being turned inside out as reality folded in on itself. 3 seconds, 5, 10. Everything was going perfectly until a red alert flashed on the screens with the call sign of the Icarus, one of the destroyers at the rear of the fleet. Their coordinates were jumping like crazy. The navigation AI was spitting out error after error. And when we emerged from the jump in the Proxima system, the Icarus materialized in the wrong spot, right in the middle of an asteroid field, with massive rocks hurtling toward it from all sides, seconds away from impact. Cortez didn't even blink. He grabbed the comms and roared an order to the captain of the Icarus to activate an emergency local jump. A short burst of a few kilometers, a risky maneuver that could tear the ship in half. I watched on the screens as the Icarus vanished in a flash of warped light, a millisecond before a 3-kilometer asteroid passed through the point where it had just been, and it emerged in a safe zone, the entire hull vibrating from the overload, but intact. The comms came alive as the captain of the Icarus reported damages. Half the navigation systems were fried, 20 people were in the medbay with concussions, but everyone was alive, and the ship was operational. Cortez exhaled, and I saw his hands trembling. He knew we were a hair's breadth away from a catastrophe, that one ship could have been smeared across those asteroids along with its crew of 300. Everyone on the bridge realized a simple truth. We are playing with forces we barely control. The technology is outstripping our understanding, and every jump is a game of Russian roulette with the laws of physics, where the stakes are human lives and humanity's future in space. But the result was worth it. We reached Proxima Centauri in 3 hours instead of a 4-year flight on conventional engines, crossing a distance of 4 light-years faster than old rockets could get to the moon. I stood by the viewport and looked at a foreign star, a red dwarf shining dimly and ominously, and I understood that humanity had just stepped out of its cradle, becoming a truly interstellar species. The fleet deployed into formation, scanners began probing the system for planets and resources, and scout drones flew off in every direction. Cortez announced over the intercom that the mission was accomplished and that we had opened a new era for humanity. But in his voice, I heard not triumph, but anxiety. Because the incident with the Icarus showed us all that we are still children playing with the toys of gods, and sooner or later, these toys will kill us if we don't learn to understand them. I rang in the year 2031 aboard the scout ship Horizon in the Keprex 4 system, where we had been sent to investigate strange energy signals detected by our long-range probes. I was the senior science officer responsible for anomaly analysis, and when we dropped out of the jump, we saw something that made me forget how to breathe. A Dyson sphere, a gargantuan construct surrounding a red dwarf, a structure the size of Earth's orbit that harvested all of the star's energy. It was technology we had only dreamed of, a project centuries ahead of us, and it just hung there in the void, ancient and majestic. Captain Amara Obiora, a Nigerian woman with chilling composure in critical situations, ordered us to close in for a scan, and at that exact moment, all the ship's systems shut down at once. Engines, weapons, communications, even the emergency lighting went dark, leaving us drifting in the black. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, the screens came back to life, but they weren't showing our data. They displayed a message in 47 languages, including a mathematical code that was impossible to misunderstand. Children playing with weapons, stop before you destroy yourselves. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, because this meant someone had been watching us, studying our languages and our culture, and considered us so primitive that they compared us to children. Then they appeared, the ships of the Antare, as they called themselves, a fleet of 20 vessels that looked nothing like anything man-made. Organic forms, flowing and changing like living tissue, biomechanics at a level we couldn't comprehend. They surrounded the horizon on all sides, not threatening us with weapons, but demonstrating absolute superiority. And I realized we had met a race that was flying through space when our ancestors hadn't even climbed down from the trees. Amara activated the first contact protocol, broadcasting signals of peace and openness, and one of their ships responded. The voice sounded directly in the heads of every crew member, a telepathic link that bypassed all technology. They said they had existed for 4 million years, that they had seen the rise and fall of thousands of civilizations, and that we had found the seed of the first. That was their name for the source, a technology from an ancient race that created it and vanished. The voice asked if we knew what the seed had done to the 17 civilizations before us, and there was an abyss of sorrow in that question, as if they had seen it over and over again, young races finding the power of gods and incinerating themselves in its flame. Amara told them that we are humans, that we learn from our mistakes, and that we wouldn't repeat the fate of those who came before us. I heard iron confidence in her voice, even though I was trembling with fear and awe. The Antare went silent for several long minutes, as if conferring with each other on levels we couldn't perceive, and then they simply said one word: "We shall see." Their ships retreated, the Horizon system surged back to life, and we regained control of the vessel, but everyone understood we weren't released because we were their equals. We were released because they decided to give us a chance to prove our words. The tension broke, but the warning was as clear as day. Humanity is under observation, being watched by beings so ancient and powerful that we are like ants to them, and one wrong move could be our last. I returned to Earth a different man, realizing that the universe isn't an empty, boundless playground for our ambitions, but a home to billions of life forms, many of which have traveled a path longer than our species has existed, and we will either learn to live with them or burn out before we ever grow up. I was sent to Nexus Station 2 months after the encounter with the Antare as part of humanity's first diplomatic mission, and I thought I was ready for anything after seeing a Dyson sphere and speaking with beings older than our civilization. But when the shuttle dropped out of the jump and I saw that station through the viewport, I realized I wasn't ready for anything at all. Nexus was the size of a small moon, a rotating city-state in neutral territory between the stars, where representatives of all the galaxy's major races gathered for trade and politics. The structure looked like the fevered dream of an architect who had blended 1,000 different styles. Organic towers grew out of metallic platforms, crystalline domes glowed from within with unknown energy, and ships flew everywhere in shapes that defied any logic of Earth engineering. I sat next to our chief diplomat, a gray-haired Frenchman named Jean-Pierre Duval, who looked as cool as a cucumber. But I could see him gripping the armrests of his chair with white knuckles, realizing that we were about to enter a hall where humanity would be judged by beings for whom our history is but the blink of an eye. We were led through the station corridors where I saw representatives of other races in person for the first time, not through screens or holograms, and every encounter was like a blow to the brain trying to process the impossible. Beings resembling floating jellyfish made of pure light conversed in colored flashes. Creatures the size of elephants on 6 legs dragged technical devices behind them whose purpose I couldn't even guess. Something like sentient plants moved their manipulator branches, discussing business in a language that smelled of cinnamon and ozone. One representative of the Trade Guild, a thin creature in a strange exoskeleton covered in runes, stopped to look at us, and I heard his thoughts in my head, a telepathic whisper full of curiosity. So this is what the new children who found the seed look like? I wonder how long they'll last before self-destructing. I wanted to say something biting back but didn't know how, and we walked on, escorted by Antare guards who glided behind us like ghosts, silent observers ensuring the wild humans didn't do anything stupid in civilized society. The hall of the Galactic Council turned out to be so massive that at first I didn't realize I was inside a room. The ceiling was lost somewhere in artificial clouds several kilometers up, and the walls were covered in holograms, showing galactic maps with all the civilizations and their territories. In the center rose a platform where representatives of the conclave of the ancients sat, the 9 oldest races who had governed galactic politics for the last several million years. And each of them was an embodiment of power and age that a human could not grasp. The Antare were there, their representative looking like a pillar of intertwined light constantly shifting shape. Next to it sat something like a living mountain made of crystals. Further along floated a cloud of nanobots that sometimes gathered into a humanoid form and sometimes scattered into a swarm and so on, each more alien and incomprehensible than the last. We were shown to seats at the far end of the hall in the observers section where representatives of young races with no voting rights sat, and I felt that humiliation more sharply than any physical pain. We had come here as petitioners, as children at a trial held by adults, and the entire hall watched us with a curiosity more suited for studying exotic animals in a zoo. I spent the next 3 days recording and analyzing everything I learned through official and unofficial channels, and the picture of the galaxy that emerged was terrifying in its complexity. The conclave of the ancients controlled the major trade routes and settled disputes between races, but their power was mostly symbolic because each ancient race had enough strength to wipe entire systems off the galactic map if they chose, and peace was maintained through mutual deterrence and millions of years of accumulated war weariness. The Void Swarmers were the nightmare of every organic civilization. A mechanical race that consumed entire worlds, turning them into parts of their infinitely growing machine, and they controlled an entire galactic arm from which they had displaced or destroyed all competitors. The trade guilds served as neutral intermediaries in all deals. Their ships were sacrosanct under an ancient treaty, and they knew the secrets and weaknesses of every race because they traded not just in goods, but in information. And the Silent Zone was a region of space from which no one ever returned. Thousands of ships from various races had vanished there over the last 1,000,000 years, and everyone had agreed to simply avoid that region without trying to understand what was happening there, because some secrets are better left uncovered. I was on the bridge of the cruiser Apollo when our expeditionary fleet of 200 ships entered the Eagle Nebula quadrant sector, where reconnaissance had discovered the ruins of an ancient civilization on one of the planets. Admiral Cortez was commanding the operation from the flagship Odyssey, and I was responsible for coordinating the energy systems between the ships, routine work I had done hundreds of times before. We dropped out of the jump in relative silence. Scanners showed a dead system with a cooled star and 3 lifeless planets, and archaeological drones were already heading for the surface when the sensors exploded with warnings. An armada emerged from behind the planet that made my heart stop. 1,000,000 Void Swarmer drones, each the size of a fighter jet, black angular death machines moving with such coordination they seemed like a single swarm of predatory insects. I barely had time to think we'd walked into a trap before the slaughter began. The first 10 seconds were a hell I will never forget. The drones attacked in waves of 1,000 units at a time, their antimatter beams cutting through our cruisers like a can opener through tin. I watched on the screens as the destroyer Prometheus simply broke in half, as the battleship Alexander Nevsky exploded from within when a beam pierced its reactor, and as the frigate Groza lost its entire bow section, beginning to spin helplessly while ejecting the bodies of the crew into space. 3 ships dead in an instant. Panic flooded all communication frequencies. Captains shouted conflicting orders. Some demanded a retreat, others called for an attack. Our captain, an old warhorse named Viktor Gromov, yelled for everyone to shut up and listen to the admiral, and Cortez's voice cut through the chaos like a thunderclap. He was ordering the activation of Protocol Sparta, a maneuver we had practiced in simulations but never used in combat because it required synchronizing all the fleet's sources into a single network, which was dangerously risky. I rushed to the energy systems console and began entering the synchronization codes, my fingers flying across the holographic keyboard faster than I thought possible. Around me, engineers were doing the same, coordinating with the other ships. The sources began to resonate with each other, energy fields merging into a single network encompassing the entire fleet, and I felt that strange sensation of connection, as if 200 ships had become one giant organism with a shared nervous system. Salvos of plasma torpedoes launched from all ships simultaneously, thousands of projectiles attacking the drone swarm in a coordinated strike. Explosions bloomed in the void like deadly flowers. Drones burned by the hundreds, then thousands, their formation crumbling under our onslaught, and for a few minutes it seemed like we were winning the battle. I saw Gromov smile as he looked at the kill count screens, saw officers starting to celebrate an early victory, and that's exactly when it appeared. The Reaper Prime, a swarmer dreadnought the size of a moon that materialized out of hyperspace like a nightmare made real, a black mountain of metal and death that blotted out half the view. The Reaper's main gun charged in 3 seconds and fired, a beam of pure destructive energy 1 kilometer wide, passing through our formation, erasing everything in its path. 20 ships simply ceased to exist, vaporized in a flash of light brighter than a star, 60,000 people dead in a single heartbeat. And I stood frozen, realizing we were all about to die. The comms crackled to life. The voice of Sophia Reyes, the flagship's chief engineer, proposed a desperate plan: overload the Odyssey's source to critical mass and create a directed gravitational vortex to rip space apart. but that meant turning the flagship into a bomb and jumping with it straight into the heart of the enemy dreadnought. Cortez agreed without hesitation. His last words over the general frequency were simple. He said that the honor of being human is the opportunity to sacrifice oneself for others, and he ordered the entire fleet to retreat while the Odyssey went for the ramming. I watched on the screens as the flagship turned and flew straight at the Reaper, its source overloaded to the limit, its hull glowing with energy, and in the final second before impact, the Odyssey jumped into hyperspace, materializing inside the enemy dreadnought. The explosion was like the birth of a new star. The Reaper Prime blew apart into atoms, taking Cortez and 200,000 crew members with it, while we survivors watched the expanding debris cloud in silence, knowing that victory had cost us 40% of the fleet and humanity's best admiral. I arrived on the dead world of Keltare 6 months after the slaughter in the Eagle Nebula as part of an archaeological expedition tasked with studying the ruins of a civilization wiped from the face of the universe millions of years ago. The planet was a nightmare. The surface was a solid field of vitrified glass, where wars capable of evaporating oceans and melting continents had once raged. The atmosphere scorched down to a thin film of toxic gases, and the sky held that dead gray color that only exists where life has vanished forever. David Chen led the excavation, an obsessed Chinese archaeologist who believed that somewhere deep within the crust lay traces of those who lived here before the catastrophe, and I was his chief technician, responsible for the drilling equipment. We dug for 3 months through layers of petrified ash and radioactive glass until the scanners detected a void at a depth of 8 kilometers, a structure of perfect geometric shape that could not be natural, and David ordered us to break through at any cost because he felt we were on the verge of something significant. When we finally breached the bunker, we found ourselves in a massive hall the size of a stadium, with walls made of a material our tools couldn't scratch, covered in inscriptions in a language no one knew, but which somehow read directly into the brain, as if the meaning entered the consciousness bypassing the eyes. In the center of the hall stood a platform, and upon it rested a device resembling a giant crystal interlaced with glowing veins of energy. And I realized this was a data vault. The memory of those who built this place millions of years ago when our ancestors hadn't even climbed down from the trees. David approached the platform with trembling hands and touched the crystal, and at that moment, the hall came alive. Holograms materialized around us, showing a being that was a symbiosis of light and matter, its form constantly flowing and shifting between humanoid and something completely alien. The voice sounded not in our ears, but directly in our heads, ancient and infinitely weary, and began to tell a story that made me forget how to breathe. The being called itself one of the first, a race that created the seed, what we called the source, a technology intended to give their children the stars and free them from all limitations of matter and energy. The voice said they were young and full of pride, believing in their ability to control the power they had discovered, but power outpaced wisdom. And 300 years after the discovery, a war began that split the galaxy. The seed turned into a weapon more terrifying than any nightmare. Planets burned like matches, entire star systems went dark as their suns were turned into fuel for death machines, and space-time was torn to shreds by the energies unleashed by the warring factions. The holograms showed scenes of destruction impossible to grasp. Fleets the size of planets clashing in the void, worlds shattering into atoms, entire galactic sectors turned into dead zones where the laws of physics ceased to function. The voice said they tried to stop the madness by creating a final version of the source from their own souls, literally sacrificing themselves to seal away the power they had unleashed. But it was too late, and 12 billion worlds perished before the chaos subsided. The final words of the recording were a warning to those who would find the seed after them. The voice said that power without wisdom is a path to oblivion, that every race finding this technology goes through the same cycle, from euphoria through war to self-destruction, and that the first were leaving this memory in hopes that someone would finally learn from their mistakes. The hologram dissolved, the hall plunged into silence, and I stood frozen, realizing that humanity is following those exact same footsteps, that we have already spilled blood in the war with the swarmers and with each other, that the Source gives us the power of gods, but we are still children playing with a weapon capable of destroying the galaxy. David Chen fell to his knees and wept, not out of grief, but from the realization of the burden that had fallen onto our shoulders, and I knew this recording would change everything, because now we had no excuses. We had been warned by those who walked this path to the end and paid a price impossible to imagine, and now the choice was ours, to repeat their fate or find another way. I was on Earth when the rebellion began, working at the Planetary Consortium's Defense Coordination Center, and I was the first to see the distress signals from the base on Europa. That moon of Jupiter housed one of the largest source production plants. General Victor Cromwell, a hero of the Swarmer War who had lost half his fleet and all his friends in that slaughter, broadcast across all frequencies that humanity had chosen the wrong path, that we were groveling before ancient races instead of showing them our strength. His words were simple and persuasive to those tired of being humiliated at the Galactic Council. He claimed we were the strongest, that the Source gave us a power to which the entire galaxy must bow or burn. 500 warships followed him, 30% of humanity's entire fleet, thousands of officers and soldiers who believed only force could protect us from the enemies surrounding us on all sides. I watched the screens as rebel ships seized the Europa base, killing loyalist guards and taking control of the production lines, and I realized a civil war had begun that could destroy humanity faster than any external foe. The battle for Earth began 2 weeks later when Cromwell's fleet dropped out of hyperspace in orbit of our homeworld. 500 ships against 700 defenders under the command of Admiral Amara Obiora, who swore the rebels would not touch the planet while she still drew breath. I was stationed on the Olympus orbital station coordinating the defensive fleet's energy systems, and through the viewports I watched the most horrific battle in human history unfold. Brother against brother in the void above the cradle of our species. The moon turned into a fortress, bristling with thousands of guns. Laser beams sliced through the darkness, leaving glowing trails in space as ships exploded like new stars being born and dying in seconds. The carnage lasted 6 hours. I saw the cruiser Spartacus ram a rebel dreadnought, sacrificing itself to save transports filled with evacuating civilians. I saw defender frigates cover the retreat of crippled ships at the cost of their own lives, both sides bleeding for ideals they believed in with equal sincerity. I screamed into my headset, coordinating energy redistribution between the shields of dying ships, but I knew we were losing because the rebels were more desperate and ready for any sacrifice. Just when it seemed the defense was about to collapse, Cromwell broadcast an ultimatum across all channels. His voice sounded weary but unyielding. He stated he had activated a doomsday source on his flagship, a bomb capable of tearing space-time apart and destroying the entire solar system by turning it into a black hole. The demand was simple: total surrender of the consortium and the transfer of power to a military council under his leadership, or he would press the button and we would all die along with the billions on Earth, Mars, and stations across the system. I saw the energy signature of his flagship on my monitors and realized he wasn't bluffing. The source was overloaded to critical mass, and one wrong move would turn our home system into a grave. Panic swept the command center. Officers shouted conflicting suggestions. Some demanded immediate surrender to save billions of lives. Others called for a suicidal attack on the rebel flagship. At that moment, every screen simultaneously switched to a broadcast from Geneva, where Leila Zhang, the creator of the source, appeared. She was 45 years old, but thanks to technology, she looked 25, and in her eyes, I saw a resolve that left no room for doubt. Leila spoke calmly, as if discussing the weather. She said that when she created the first source, she embedded emergency shutdown codes into every single unit, an insurance policy in case humanity went mad and turned this power against itself. And now, the moment had come to use it. Her fingers danced across a holographic keyboard, entering a sequence of commands known only to her, and I watched the screens as, one by one, the sources on all of Cromwell's ships deactivated. The energy simply vanished, leaving them drifting helpless in the void. The doomsday source on the flagship went dark a second before detonation. The rebel fleet turned into heaps of dead metal, and the battle ended not with a victory of weapons, but with the triumph of wisdom from the woman who, 10 years ago, had given humanity the power of gods, and now showed that true power lies in the ability to restrain that power. Cromwell was captured an hour later. At his trial, he claimed he wanted to protect humanity from galactic threats, to which Layla replied that by defending only through force, he had become the very monster he was trying to protect us from. The lesson was learned by everyone who saw that slaughter over Earth. Power without wisdom and compassion leads only to self-destruction. I stood in the hall of the Galactic Council on Nexus Station, a month after the suppression of Cromwell's rebellion, part of the human delegation invited to an emergency session, and the atmosphere was so tense the air felt electrified. Representatives from 40 races filled the giant hall, each looking at us with expressions ranging from contempt to pity. The main item on the agenda sounded like a death sentence: what to do with the humans who, in just 10 years, had nearly destroyed themselves twice and shown the galaxy how dangerous children with the weapons of gods could be. The Antare demanded total isolation for humanity. Their representative argued that we were a danger to ourselves and everyone else, and that the solar system should be surrounded by an energy barrier, keeping us locked up until we either matured or went extinct, whichever came first. The Trade Guild proposed a milder option, restricting our technology and placing all our actions under constant monitoring, turning humanity into wards who couldn't take a step without permission from their elders. The Void Swarmers were silent as usual, but their fleets stood at the borders of our space, a wordless threat ready to erase us if the Council made that call. And I realized the fate of our species hung by a thread. Layla Zhang rose to speak on behalf of all humanity, a small woman before a hall full of beings as ancient as civilization itself, and her voice was calm but carried a core of unyielding steel. She began by admitting guilt, saying we were young and had made mistakes that almost cost us everything, that we had spilled our own blood and the blood of others in wars we could have avoided had we been wiser. But most importantly, that we learned from these mistakes instead of repeating them. Layla said the Source had given us the power of gods, but that we recognized we had not received their wisdom, that we understood our place in the galaxy not as masters, but as younger brothers in need of guidance from our elders, and she asked for a chance to prove we were capable of becoming part of the galactic community through service rather than dominance. I saw some representatives of the ancient races look at each other in surprise, unaccustomed to hearing such words from a young race that usually, at this stage of development, demands respect and equality through the force of arms. And I knew Layla was saying exactly what needed to be said to be heard. Then she laid out the proposals we had spent weeks preparing, knowing this was our only chance to avoid isolation or worse. First, the demilitarization of our armed forces by 50%, reducing the fleet and destroying the most dangerous weapons under the supervision of Council representatives, proving we did not intend to threaten the galaxy. Second, placing all source technologies under international control, creating a joint commission where the ancient races would have veto power over any application of that force, a guarantee that we could not use it for war again without the approval of those wiser than us. Third, and most importantly, the creation of the Galactic Guardian Corps, a fleet manned by humans but operating under a council mandate to protect young civilizations from threats like the swarmers or pirates, turning our military might from a threat into a tool for protecting the weak. The hall erupted in discussion. Ancient races argued among themselves in languages I didn't understand. Holograms showed models of the consequences of each proposal, and I stood there with bated breath, knowing the next few hours would decide humanity's future for centuries to come. The debates lasted 72 hours, 3 days without sleep as we sat in the waiting area, listening to the echoes of the ancients' arguments, until finally the council's chief arbiter announced the voting results. Humanity's proposal was accepted by a majority vote, contingent on a 100-year probationary period, an entire century during which we would be watched and every action evaluated to decide if we were worthy of remaining part of the galactic community or if we should be isolated forever. I heard Layla exhale in relief, saw tears on the faces of other delegation members, and felt a weight heavier than a planet lift from my own shoulders, the weight of responsibility for the future of our entire species that we had carried for those 3 days. Humanity was given a second chance, not because we were strong or dangerous, but because, for the first time in our history, we admitted our mistakes and asked for help instead of demanding respect through force. It was a lesson that all generations after us would remember, that true strength is found not in weapons, but in the ability to acknowledge one's weakness and seek wisdom from those who have walked the path before us. I was aboard the Guardian's flagship, Dawn of Hope, when a distress signal came from the Silent Zone, that region of the galaxy where no one had returned from for the last 1,000,000 years. And the coordinates pointed to the system of the Ket-Ray, a young race that had only just mastered interstellar flight. The transmission was breaking up with static, but I could hear the panic in their voices. They were screaming about something devouring their star, about swarms of beings made of pure darkness that were sucking the energy out of everything living, turning worlds into a dead cold. Admiral Amara Obiora called an emergency meeting of the Guardian Command. 1,000 ships of our new fleet stood ready. Ships that were not cruisers of war, but carriers of light, as we now called ourselves. And everyone waited for the decision on whether we would enter the zone from which there might be no return. The Galactic Council was paralyzed with fear. The Antare flatly refused to intervene, saying it was too dangerous even for them, that the Devourers were a threat as ancient as the galaxy itself, and that it was better to sacrifice one young race than to risk everyone else. Amara listened to them in silence, then looked at me and the other officers with that piercing gaze of hers, and said that humanity had been given a chance to prove its worth, and now was the moment for that proof, even if it cost us everything. We dropped out of the jump on the edge of the Ket-Ray system and saw a scene out of a nightmare. Their star was dying right before our eyes, a red giant dimming and shrinking as if something was draining its very life force, surrounded by millions of creatures that weren't matter in the conventional sense. The Devourers looked like tears in the fabric of reality, black spots of absolute void surrounded by a halo of dying light, beings of pure entropy that fed on any form of energy, turning it into nothingness. The Ket-Ray planets were already dead, their cities had gone dark, their oceans were frozen, and billions of sentient beings had died in the cold and dark while we were flying to their aid. I saw the last refugee ships trying to break out of the system, and the Devourers overtaking them, touching the hulls, and sucking the energy from the reactors in seconds, leaving behind only drifting coffins. Amara ordered the fleet to deploy into battle formation. 1,000 Guardian ships lined up like a wall between the Devourers and the last Ket-Ray survivors. And I knew that a battle was about to begin that would decide not only the fate of this race, but humanity's place in the galaxy for centuries to come. The first strike was a classic tactic. All ships simultaneously released a wall of plasma kilometers thick, a fiery barrier meant to incinerate the enemy. But the Devourers simply floated through it, absorbing the energy and becoming larger and brighter, as if we were feeding them instead of killing them. I watched the screens in horror, seeing our attack making the enemy stronger, seeing the creatures of entropy grow as they fed on our weapons, and I realized that brute force wouldn't work here. that we were facing an opponent that turns any energy to its own advantage. Amara saw the same thing. Her face turned to stone as she realized she had led the fleet into a trap from which there might be no exit. Then, from the far end of the formation, Sophia Reyes made contact. The chief fleet engineer who had survived the Eagle Nebula slaughter 6 years ago and had since dedicated her life to studying the source. Her voice was calm, as if she were discussing a routine problem. Sophia said we had to do the opposite, not attack with energy, but create a barrier that would take energy away, turning the sources from weapons into a vacuum, sucking the power out of the devourers themselves, a void cage that would lock them in a region of absolute zero where even entropy dies. Every ship in the fleet synchronized into a single network. 1,000 sources began to resonate at a frequency Sophia had calculated in seconds using quantum computers, and I felt the space around us warp in a completely new way. Instead of radiating energy, we were creating a dome that absorbed it, a sphere of absolute void expanding from our fleet and covering the devourer swarm like a net. The entropy beings thrashed in panic, showing something like emotion for the first time. They tried to break out, but the barrier held, and I saw them begin to decay into quantum dust, their bodies, those tears in reality, closing and vanishing as if they had never existed. After 10 minutes that felt like an eternity, the last devourer dissolved into nothing. The Kettray star began to recover, regaining its brightness, and the surviving refugee ships broadcast their gratitude on all frequencies, weeping with relief that their race had not gone completely extinct. Amara sat in the captain's chair with her eyes closed, and when she opened them, I saw not triumph, but the exhaustion of a person who understands that this is only the beginning, that humanity has now taken on the responsibility of protecting the weak from the horrors of the galaxy, and this is a burden we will carry to the end of our days, proving to the ancient races that we are worthy of the chance we were given. I stood next to Layla Zhang on the balcony of New Geneva 3 years after the rescue of the Kettray, looking out at an Earth adorned with thousands of floating cities that glowed in the twilight like a swarm of fireflies. I could hardly believe this was the same planet where I was born 50 years ago, though I looked 30 thanks to life extension technology. Layla had aged very little. She was nearly 50, but time seemed to have stopped for her. She stood motionless, gazing at the hologram of the Galactic Council materializing before the balcony. All 9 representatives of the Conclave of the Ancients were present in person, something that happened only once in a millennium. The Antare representative spoke first, his voice sounding directly in our heads, filled with something resembling respect. He said that humans had passed a trial that lasted only 18 years, but felt like an eternity for a young race. The words were simple, but as heavy as a historical verdict. He said that for the first time in the 4 million years of their civilization's existence, they were seeing a race that renounced dominance for the sake of service, choosing to protect the weak instead of conquering the strong, and that this wisdom, arriving so early, deserved recognition no one had received before us. The Antare hologram bowed in a gesture I had learned to understand as a sign of the deepest respect, and uttered words I will remember for the rest of my days, however long I may live. Welcome to the Commonwealth of Light, full members of the galactic community with a vote in the Council and the protection of all the ancient races. Layla didn't cry, but I saw her hands tremble as she gripped the balcony railing. She simply nodded, accepting this recognition as her due after everything we had been through, all the sacrifices and mistakes that had led us to this moment. Other representatives of the conclave added their own words of welcome. Even the silent void swarmers sent a message acknowledging humanity as a worthy adversary and ally. High praise from a machine civilization that usually recognized no one but themselves. The holograms dissolved, leaving us alone on the balcony, and Layla turned to me with a smile that was both joyful and sad. She said we had paid a high price for this recognition, hundreds of thousands dead in wars and conflicts, but now their sacrifices had gained a meaning that would outlast the centuries. We stood in silence, watching the panorama of the solar system unfold before us on a giant holographic screen. Earth at the center, surrounded by rings of orbital stations. Mars covered in the domes of terraformed cities where millions were building a new civilization. The Kuiper Belt dotted with thousands of mining complexes and research bases. The Guardian fleet patrolled the system's borders, hundreds of ships gliding between planets like silvery fish in an ocean of void, each ready at any moment to jump to the other side of the galaxy where someone might need help. I saw transports carrying aid to the recovering worlds of the Ket-Ray, research vessels heading out to explore uncharted regions, and diplomatic missions flying to establish contact with races that had previously considered us savages unworthy of attention. In 20 years, humanity had transformed from a lonely species on the fringes of the galaxy into a force that was changing the very fabric of the interstellar community. Not through conquest, but by the example of how a young race can grow up without losing its humanity in the process. The final frame I saw before we left the balcony was the image of the ship Hope departing for deep space, a massive vessel 20 kilometers long, carrying thousands of volunteers from every corner of human space. Their mission was simple and grand at the same time: to seek out other young races just beginning their journey to the stars and help them avoid the mistakes that nearly destroyed humanity, to pass on the wisdom bought with the blood of our fallen and the tears of our survivors. I thought about the words that had become our civilization's motto after all the trials. Power makes you a god, but responsibility makes you human. We chose the latter, not because we were weak, but because we finally understood that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the ability to create and protect. The ship Hope jumped into hyperspace, vanishing in a flash of warped light, and I knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter in human history. A chapter where we would become for others what the Antares and the ancient races were for us. Teachers and protectors, helping the young find their way among the stars without repeating the errors of the past.